Welcome to the Momentum Lifestyle Podcast, where we interview an inspiring, educational, and entertaining guest to help you build confidence, find balance, and live a life of impact. We'd like to thank our sponsor today, Be Spunky. Now, Blake, Genoa, and myself have been using their Reboot product for well over 6 months now, and it has been life-changing. I found myself recovering faster, having way more energy throughout the day, and honestly feeling just more jacked up as a man. And this is because Reboot is clinically formulated to support healthy male hormone levels, providing stress relief, improved strength and stamina, enhanced drive, and overall well-being. Be Spunky Reboot contains a proprietary blend of 10 natural and organic herbs and active ingredients that are renowned for helping men to enhance physical and cognitive performance, improve stamina, energy, and endurance, optimize testosterone levels, support healthy reproductive function, support cardiovascular function, relieve stress, mild anxiety, irritability, relieve tiredness, fatigue, support healthy sleep patterns, and support healthy body weight. So as you can see, it is a must-have product for all men. So head to their website, bespunky.com.au. That's bespunki.com.au, and use the code MOMENTUM to receive 10% off all Be Spunky products.
And Lembke, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am very excited to talk all things addictions, and your book Dopamine Nation, which was mind-blowing for me, having done a lot of research on addictions, but you definitely brought a very different angle to it, which I'm excited to explore today. What I'll get you to do before we get into it is just give like a 90-second spiel on who you are and a bit about the background.
Sure. So I am a physician. I'm a psychiatrist and also professor at Stanford University School of Medicine in Stanford, California. I'm chief of our addiction medicine dual diagnosis clinic. And I'm kind of the classic clinician educator, scholar type thing. I see patients, I do research, and I teach medical students and residents how to see patients and do research.
And you're the author of a brilliant book, Dopamine Nation.
Yes. I forgot about that. Yes.
So there's so much to talk about, but I want to start because obviously in your work, in your world, this is very different, but from my experience, there's still a lot of people that are unaware of exactly what an addiction is, and probably for a lot of them unaware that they have an addiction. We'll get into kind of phones and technology in a second, but can you give your kind of definition of addictions?
Sure. Broadly speaking, addiction is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. If we were going to use the criteria that are listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, edition 5, they could be summarized by the 4 C's plus 2 physiologic symptoms. The 4 C's are out of control use, compulsive use, craving, and continued use despite consequences. And the 2 physiologic symptoms are tolerance, needing more of a drug over time to get the same effect, or finding that your drug stops working over time at the current dose. And then withdrawal, meaning that when you stop or decrease your use, you have a classic withdrawal syndrome. So those are the ways that we diagnose addiction in the mental health care field. Importantly, you'll note that there was nothing about quantity or frequency in that diagnosis. It's not because quantity and frequency don't matter. In fact, the more you use and the more often you use, the more likely you are to get addicted. One of the biggest risk factors for addiction is simple access to drugs. If you live in a world where you have access, you're more likely to be exposed and more likely to get addicted. Also, importantly, there's no brain scan or blood test to diagnose addiction. It's based on what we call phenomenology, patterns of behavior that are similar across cultures, across time periods, and across individuals.
So based on that description, one would assume that someone who can't help themselves but pick up their phone and text while driving is somewhat of an addiction, because there's a massive consequence and risk.
That's for sure. Boy, that's one that really makes me crazy when I see that. and I've actually, I've been guilty of it, not texting, but just picking up my phone while I've been driving and talking on it. It's an important point, and the answer is no. That alone does not equate to addiction. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So we do have this concept of risky use, and there are lots of ways people can engage in risky use without necessarily meeting threshold criteria for addiction. So for example, a college student could, in their freshman year at college, binge drink and end up so intoxicated that they need an emergency transport to the hospital, need to have their stomach pumped and almost die. That person has clearly engaged in harmful and risky use. And yet that person, that might've been the very first time they ever drank alcohol, right? So we don't, those things are not necessarily equal. They're related, right? The Venn diagram overlaps, but they're not the same thing.
So what would, and I'm really interested, I don't know if you've explored the work of Johann Hari, but his new book, Stolen Focus, for me was fascinating around phones and tech as well. What would a phone addiction look like then? If you're saying, picking up your phone, at the term you used was risky use, but is it like daily for the, and I know this is obviously a sliding scale based on what you just said, but what would a phone addiction then look like if someone really struggles to not pick up their phone while driving or texting? What would that look like in your eyes?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, we have to look at the 4 C's, and it would have to be a pattern of behavior over time. So just simply one time, picking up your phone and texting while driving would not constitute an addiction. It would constitute risky use, potentially even fatal use to yourself and others, but it could just be really poor judgment or impulsivity or, what have you. It's not necessarily a part of this chronic maladaptive pattern, which we consider addiction to be, that speaks to a physiologic change in the brain such that even once we identify that it's a problem, we struggle to stop that behavior. And so the time sequence here really matters. So if an individual plans not to text on their phone while driving, has already gotten into trouble texting on their phone while driving, swears that when they get in the car this time, they're not going to text while driving, and then yet picks up the phone and texts while driving, that would be highly suggestive of somebody having developed an addiction.
I'm interested in your thoughts on phones, and I've listened to a lot of your interviews over the last couple of months, and I don't know if I've heard one where you talk specifically or too much about phones, but I'm really interested in your take on this, what feels like a tipping point as a collective, where techs and social media's, one of their primary roles is to get us on the phones as much as possible.
Right.
And, reading Johann Hari's work, and he referenced someone in there, but they were kind of divided as to is there responsibility on tech to not create such an addictive tendency, or is there, more of a pull from an ownership point of view on the individual not to get drawn into it? How do you see that as it stands at the moment, which seems like a really big problem for a lot of people?
The way that I think about this is to think about the smartphone as akin to a pack of cigarettes. Certainly, we as individuals have to take personal responsibility for either, quitting or using in a more responsible manner. I think it's different from cigarettes, because we know even 1 cigarette a day can cause cancer, whereas checking your phone once a day is probably perfectly okay, and even more than that. But clearly there's a point at which it's too much. So we have individual responsibility to change these behaviors, and Dopamine Nation is really all about what we as individuals can do to manage our compulsive overconsumption wherever we lie on the addiction spectrum. But I also think it's the responsibility of the corporations who make these devices, as well as schools and governments and other regulatory bodies. And again, we can think about the cigarettes. There's significant taxation of cigarettes. And in the United States, smoking really went down when we started heavily taxing cigarettes. There are rules and regulations about whether or not cigarettes can be advertised to minors or sold to minors. So we have regulatory structures in place that say, no, you can't advertise cigarettes to children. You can't sell cigarettes to children. So it's both. It's going to be both the bottom up and the top down. And we're seeing this, significantly in countries all over the world. So for example, in China, the government just implemented a restriction on video game playing among minors to no more than 2 days per week, no more than 2 hours a day. And you have to show ID and, you have to all of this. And of course, people are finding all kinds of workarounds, but basically putting that barrier in place makes it harder for kids to play video games, make sure that when kids are playing video games, they're on at the same time as their friends are on. And when their friends can't be on, they can't be on either, which I think is very helpful because, of course, one of the big things is the fear of missing out. Oh, all my friends are on and I'm not on. In Great Britain, I believe they just passed a law restricting online pornography to adults. So it's now law in Great Britain, as I understand it, that you have to be of a certain age to access pornography sites. Those are the types of top-down kinds of regulations that I think are absolutely vital, and that our schools and and the corporations that make these devices and our government is responsible for implementing. At the same time, we can't say it's all Facebook's fault, right? We have to take responsibility for our own consumption.
What's your belief? And you have some very interesting ones around this, which I think when I was listening to your chat with Tom Billieu, you kind of said caused a little bit of friction. But what's your belief around easy access and how comfortable we are in the world we live these days?
Yeah, we live in this hyper convenient world where we have 24 access to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors. And that means that we're constantly titillating ourselves in ways large and small throughout the course of a single day without even realizing it. We're drinking really potent coffee. We're eating, high sugar foods. We're playing, half an hour of our favorite online game. We're, texting and tweeting and, putting a little money down on a little bit of Bitcoin and, you name it. A million different ways we're all sort of engaging in these high reward behaviors. At the same time that we're very insulated from anything that causes any kind of discomfort, right? We don't have to walk to get our food or really anything else we need. We just can get on our phones and order it to our homes. We're not exposed to weather really, or at least most of us aren't living in rich nations. We don't have to, deal with the elements or the ebbs and flows of the natural world. We basically, we're like in these cocoons that we've created for ourselves to optimize our comfort and minimize our pain. And I think it's really wreaking havoc on our brains.
Can I get you to go into a little bit, and you mentioned this in the book, a little bit around the correlation between those very comfortable nations and what you saw when it comes to general kind of addiction and happiness?
Yeah, so this is really startling, but what the data show is that rates of happiness are going down in rich nations. So people in the United States rated themselves as being more happy in 2008 than they were in 2018. And this was a general worldwide survey. And so the same things were found in places like New Zealand, right? And all over the world, with people being least happy in the richest nations. If we then look at surveys looking at rates of psychopathology, like depression, like anxiety, like suicide, what we see is those rates have been steadily going up all over the world, and they've been going up fastest in the richest nations in the world. So we have some of the highest suicide rates in places like the United States and New Zealand. If we look at addiction rates are rising. And they're not only rising, across all demographic groups, but they're even rising in groups that we previously thought were relatively insulated to the problem of addiction, including women and older people. So, for example, rates of alcohol addiction have increased 80% in women in the past 30 years and 50% in people over age 65. So what we're seeing is sort of the perils of successful capitalism. We consume, therefore we are, to make a play on Descartes' famous quote, "I think, therefore I am." And so, consumption has become our reason for being. And yet the more we consume and the more we pleasure ourselves, the less happy we are.
What is a solution in your eyes? Obviously, you mentioned kind of discomfort and the need for it and the value in it, but based on how good we've got it, what's a solution directly on that, do you think, for us?
Well, I mean, my sort of pathway for getting into some kind of individual and collective recovery is really threefold. First, it's identifying and abstaining from the intoxicants that we use, which can come in so many different forms, from sugar to shopping, to gambling to gaming, you name it. The second thing is to actually intentionally invite pain into our lives, which again can come in many forms. It can be physical or psychological discomfort, or even some kind of physiologic restraint like intermittent fasting. And then the third thing is radical honesty, intentionally, proactively trying to tell no lies, and in doing so, upregulate our prefrontal cortex and thereby help manage the reflexive, pleasure-seeking parts of our brain.
On that radical honesty, I don't know what got you into addictions, but what got me really interested in it is a parent figure who's had an addiction their whole life. I haven't known them any other way. Fingers crossed that changes, but obviously after 35 years, I'm not kind of hanging too much on it. But one of the things that I find really challenging, until I kind of looked into the work of Gabor Mate, and we'll talk about that in a second in terms of the relationship with trauma and your difference in opinion. But one of the things that helped me find empathy was understanding that it wasn't about me, and it wasn't like, how could you possibly choose the drink over me or whatever it might be. What's your relationship with, and your stories in your book are brilliant, but for someone who doesn't understand addictions, it's easy to shame someone. It's easy to take it personally. What would you say to someone who is around an addict in terms of how to potentially have more empathy and understanding of what they're going through?
Yeah, so I would also echo the idea that it's not that the person is choosing their drug over you. It's that the disease of addiction is characterized by the loss of ability to choose. That when people get into that addiction vortex, the physiology is overwhelming. They must reach for another drink or another smoke or whatever it is, as a way to maintain biochemical homeostasis that they're caught in, and because of the way that our brains adapt to, chronic exposure to drugs of any sort.
So what would be your recommendation for someone in terms of understanding and empathy in terms of how to manage it? Because again, I guess from looking at it almost from a bird's eye view, experiencing as a coach and obviously firsthand in terms of a family member, shame's not going to help. Do you know what I mean? Because it's only going to really dig in deeper. So how do you approach someone with an addiction as opposed to telling them off because, they got up in the middle of the night to eat chocolate or watch porn or drink alcohol, instead of shaming them or, making judgment or guilt or, creating kind of fear and guilt in them? What's an approach as a family member, as a partner, as a work colleague? What would you suggest?
Well, I think it's very natural and human to feel very angry at the loved one who's continuing to, act out their addiction. But unfortunately, our anger and resentment about that never helps. So what I always recommend is do whatever you need to do to get into a place of being sort of at peace and essentially letting go of your ability to control what they're doing or try to manage it or even influence it in any way. So some kind of really radical acceptance around what is and the possibility that it will always be, which is sort of how you started out. And I think that's very healthy, kind of this acknowledgement that I'm very sad about this, but I'm not holding my breath for anything about it to change, which is very, very hard to do, especially if you're dealing with a younger person, your child. But I think that kind of radical acceptance of what is and the possibility that we have very limited, if any, control or influence over what our loved one, what happens to them because of this terrible disease, allows us then to enter in an interaction with them from a place that's likely to be much more persuasive, because it doesn't have that same kind of heated urgency that's about my needs. You can come to it with, it's really about you and your needs and what you can do. And then I think just, honestly reflecting back to them our sadness. So instead of presenting with the anger, finding the sadness behind the anger and the grief, and just expressing that, the love combined with the sadness, combined with the hope for them that they could have a better life, and your knowledge about, if you have it, about the fact that treatment really does work and people do get into recovery even very late in life. So trying to encourage them to consider that path at the same time that you're not holding it too tightly.
Talking of paths of recovery, what I've found really interesting, I guess, having studied your work ever since your book came out and listened to so many different interviews of yours, is for me this hybrid of your work with what obviously AA do, and then Gabor Mate's take on trauma. How do you see trauma playing a role in one's addiction, and how do you potentially see where trauma hasn't played a role, e.g., as you said, the accessibility that has become just so apparent over the last kind of 15 to 20 years?
Well, it's very clear from the medical literature and also from my work with patients that people who have experienced significant childhood trauma are at increased risk of developing addiction. And that works probably on an epigenetic level as well as a psychological level. So it's clear that trauma is a risk factor, but it's not the only risk factor. There are many other risk factors, and simple access is one of the biggest risk factors today. Furthermore, I think it's important to acknowledge that you can have the perfect life, the perfect childhood, the perfect spouse, the perfect job, the perfect friendship network, and you can still get really, really addicted. One of the things that I think has happened in the mental health care profession, which I think is a little bit dangerous and a bit gone astray, is that we've all become so convinced that trauma is the cause that I see patients and providers searching for trauma even when there isn't trauma, as a way to understand why a person gets addicted. Now, certainly in some instances, trauma plays a role, but it doesn't play a role in every instance. And even if it does play a role, you can't just get stuck on the causative etiology of the addiction, right? We have to move past that. There has to be a point at which we say, okay, this happened to me, it was bad, but now I do actually have some choices about how I'm going to make my life better. And so what can I do about my addictive use? So I think really, really important to recognize trauma, to process the trauma. Trauma clearly is a risk factor for addiction, but not every person who gets addicted is a victim of significant trauma. And even if we do have a trauma history, just perseverating on the trauma and seeing ourselves as victims is not going to get us into recovery. We have to really, moving through recovery is much more behavioral than that.
Which ties in a little bit to the point that you danced very lightly on in your book around the almost the overprescription and the lack of resilience that we have in today's world. And coming back to kind of, point 2 for you, intentionally inviting pain. Do you feel like we've gone too far the other way of overprescribing and really struggling to create a lack of resilience to help us through, some of these things that we need to navigate?
Yes, I do. I mean, the 1990s was the decade of the brain. That was when I was trained in the field of psychiatry. There was this promise then that there was a pill for every type of pain. And we really believed that. And here we are, a good 20, 30 years later. And what we're seeing is rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide are higher than ever. The countries where there is the most access to mental health treatment, including prescriptions of antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, we actually have the highest rates of depression and anxiety. So, cause and effect, I think we have to look hard at that and really question what we're doing. And I would definitely say that there's a way in which we're kind of medicating things that ultimately are not the cause of a brain psychopathology in the form of like, this is a deep-seated biological depression. I think there are many ways in which we're just medicating everyday normal human suffering. And in doing so, not only exposing ourselves to the potential for addiction to these prescription pills and misuse, but also depriving ourselves of the opportunity to build the mental calluses that will allow us to be resilient in the face of life's challenges.
There's money that is involved in some of those processes as well, I assume, in terms of overprescribing, but we won't take that path. So what do you, I mean, it's, for me, it's, you stated it brilliant in that, and this leads us really nicely into the pleasure pain bit, which is such a big part of your work, in that we really do chase more of the pleasure, and we're doing everything that we can to avoid the pain. And obviously on an emotional level, you know, seeking the happiness, joy, fulfillment, you know, and doing everything we can to avoid anger, frustration, sadness, fury, rage, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So what does that look like as we kind of lead nicely into the pleasure pain and the core of your work? What is pleasure pain, and why is it so heavily linked to addictions and its impact?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important to understand first and foremost that we have evolved over millions of years of evolution to approach pleasurable stimuli and avoid painful ones. It's not something that we need to think about. It's not something that we have to will or anticipate. It's entirely reflexive. We do it instinctively. And it's essentially what's allowed us to survive over millions of years of evolution in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. How does the brain do this? How does the brain process pleasure and pain? Well, one of the most exciting discoveries in neuroscience in the past 75 years or so is that pleasure and pain are co-located. So that means that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So if you imagine that in your reward pathway, which is the lower brain, highly conserved part of your brain, it's been the same and unchanged for millions of years, there's a balance like a beam on a central fulcrum. And that balance represents how we process pleasure and pain. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way. When we experience pain, it tips the other. And one of the overarching rules governing this balance is that it wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tipped for very long to the side of pleasure or pain. And our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what we call homeostasis. How does the brain restore a level balance? By first tipping an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus was before going back to the level position. So let me give you an example. If I eat a piece of chocolate, I get a little release of dopamine in my pleasure centers of the brain. Dopamine is our reward neurotransmitter. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in the experience of pleasure, motivation, and reward, but it's probably the final common pathway for all reinforcing substances and behaviors. And my balance then tips to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than my brain will start to downregulate dopamine transmission as a way to bring me in balance again. But it doesn't just bring dopamine firing levels to baseline, it actually brings them below baseline before going level again. So there's a price to pay for that pleasure. I think of this as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they like it on the balance, so they stay on until it's tipped an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the come down, the after effect, or in my case, that moment of desperately wanting to eat one more piece of chocolate, even though I know I shouldn't. If I wait long enough, the gremlins hop off, balance is restored, that craving goes away, and I move on in my day. But if I continue to eat chocolate repetitively over hours to days to weeks to months to years to try to recreate that initial feeling, it might initially work by eating more chocolate, but once created, those gremlins never go away, and they multiply and they get stronger over time, so that eventually I end up with enough gremlins on the pain side of my balance to fill this whole room. Now I've entered into the addicted brain. I now have changed my pleasure pain set point such that I am walking around with a balance chronically tilted to the side of pain. Those gremlins have their tents and barbecues in tow. They're not going anywhere fast, which is exactly why people with severe addiction will relapse even weeks and months after they've stopped using, because the gremlins take a long time to hop off the balance once they've been created and once we're in that dopamine deficit state. And when we're in that state, now I need to use my drug not to get high, but just to feel normal. When I'm not using, I'm experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. And I've lost relative interest in other things that used to give me pleasure because I have this narrow focus on my drug of choice, obtaining it, using it, trying to level my balance, and then dealing with the craving of when I'm not using and it's tipped to the side of pain. This is what happens in the brain of people with severe addiction. Now, with enough abstinence, eventually those neuroadaptation gremlins get the message. They say, okay, nothing's happening on the pleasure side. We might as well hop off. And then homeostasis is restored. But in the meantime, it's very, very difficult to do that. Abstaining is really hard because of the intense physiologic drive that results from those gremlins sitting on the pain side of the balance. That dopamine deficit state is really kind of an overwhelming physiologic urge. You might even think of it, imagine you got a bad case of poison ivy or poison oak and you had a terrible rash that was really itchy. Imagine the cognitive load that it takes not to scratch that itch. And let's say you make it through the whole day and you manage not to do it. And then you wake yourself up in the middle of the night from sleep, violently scratching that itch. That's what people with severe addiction are dealing with. And in fact, I have lots of patients with sex and pornography addiction who will be roused in the middle of the night from a pornographic dream, something that they don't even have control over. But it's because those neural circuits have been created and those gremlins desperately want us to use because they want to stay on the balance. That's the way to conceptualize what's going on. That's essentially the disease model of addiction and why it can be so difficult to stop, even when, that individual really wants to stop.
I think you said in one of your interviews, it might have been with Tom Bilyeu, that 1/3 of your clientele at the moment is around porn addiction. Is that right? Something along those lines? Or it might have been at the time of then?
Yeah. So, growing, I would say around 2010, I started to see more and more middle-aged men in particular coming in with unmanageable sex and pornography addiction. And every single one of them said it was the advent of the smartphone in around 2001 that tipped them over the edge from recreational use to maladaptive addictive use. So it was this access, right? The ways in which that 24/7 portable device means we can use anywhere, anytime, that created the destabilization of their dopamine pleasure pain pathway that led to this point where they were doing things that were really, really risky and putting at risk their jobs, their marriages, et cetera. And that continues to this day. Pornography addiction is really probably the biggest and most hidden, and certainly I think most shameful addiction that people are struggling with in the modern world, because so many other types of addictions are sort of socially sanctioned and okay.
You talk about the gremlins and you love that analogy throughout your book. What's your belief on, obviously, going cold turkey as opposed to if that itch or if that scratch is like so intense, would a little taste of porn, a little taste of alcohol take enough pain out that you could continue? You use 30 days, I think, as an example of a time frame. But let's say after, 10 days, you're fucking losing your mind. Would a little taste of that really just balance it out a little bit? Or do you still just do whatever you can to stay cold turkey and just ride through as the gremlins rebalance themselves?
Yeah. So the real trick in order to restore healthy homeostasis and a level balance is that you need to abstain for consecutive days, long enough for those gremlins to hop off and for homeostasis to be restored. And even dipping in a little bit is essentially going to plunge you back to that dopamine deficit state. Let me give you an example from the animal literature. There's a very famous experiment of rats who were injected with cocaine over 7 consecutive days. And rats will normally hang out in the sort of the side of a cage. They don't like to run across the middle. But with each injection of cocaine over successive days, the rats started running more and more. And by day 7, we're in this running frenzy, crisscrossing the cage multiple times. Then the cocaine was withdrawn and the running subsided. And the rat was given no cocaine for a year, which is a rat lifetime, which is a really long time. And then about a year later, that rat was then again injected with cocaine. And what the scientists saw was the rat immediately began running in that running frenzy as they had done on day 7 of those 7 consecutive injections. In other words, there's some latent permanent brain change that occurs once we've been exposed to enough of these drugs. We don't know what constitutes enough. It probably varies person to person and drug to drug, but there's some threshold that people and animals cross such that there's sort of a permanent scar. And if that animal then is exposed to that drug again, they'll be plunged right back to where they were in the depths of their addiction, which of course you will hear all the time experientially from people with addiction to things like drugs and alcohol, that even a little bit and they're right back in it. And it's just devastating, of course. So the answer is no, you can't dip your toe in a little bit.
What's your process then for those that, like, for some of them coming off alcohol or marijuana, I know is a big one as well. What can help one soothe what is a very itchy scratch, through that kind of 30 days? Where do you tend to guide them to help make that process a little bit less painful?
Yeah. So paradoxically, what I actually prescribe to patients is pain. Because by pressing on the pain side of the balance, those gremlins are agnostic to which is the initial stimulus. If we press on pleasure, they'll jump on pain. But if we press on pain, they'll jump on pleasure. And so by doing things that are intentionally, psychologically and physically uncomfortable or painful, we can actually trick our bodies into upregulating production of dopamine and other feel-good hormones like our endogenous cannabinoid system, our endogenous opioid system, norepinephrine, serotonin. So I will prescribe to my patients, especially embodied discomfort, getting out of your head and doing something that's physically very intense or engaging, or even I would say moderately painful. This can be exercise, this can be ice cold water showers, this can be intermittent fasting, or even just, for some people, just going on a walk, getting up off the couch. Unplugging from their computers for a period of time. All of that creates, withdrawal, anxiety, discomfort. And so actually tolerating that and then even drilling down on that through a process called hormesis, which is the science of using mild to moderate noxious stimuli to actually upregulate things like dopamine. So that's one of the things that I recommend. The other thing that I prescribe to patients is radical honesty. And it's a method of actively and intentionally telling the truth about everything. So the average adult tells 1 to 2 lies per day. Usually these are little white lies about things that seem inconsequential. But what avoiding even those white lies does is that it probably activates and upregulates the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is that gray matter area right behind our brain, our forehead involved in delayed gratification, future planning, and storytelling. And when things are working well in our brains, then the prefrontal cortex is talking with the pleasure pain pathway. And there's a clear circuits of communication where the prefrontal cortex helps us modulate and be aware of what our pleasure pain balance is actually doing. What happens in addiction is that we essentially sever the communication between the prefrontal cortex and the pleasure pain pathway, such that the pleasure pain pathway and the gremlins are driving the bus, and we lose our ability to manage that. So by actively telling the truth about, everything, what we're using, but also other things, we can upregulate the prefrontal cortex and get our communication lines back online between the pleasure centers and our sort of storytelling and future planning parts of the brain, and then help ourselves to strengthen our ability to abstain or moderate use.
One of the things, as I was listening, I was watching the interview with Tom Billier yesterday, and the whole, obviously, gremlins, pleasure, pain. Last year I spent the whole year training for an Ironman, and I'd be interested to see where you put exercise in this pleasure pain, because for me, there was a lot of pain in that training. But I've never been on such a high for a full year in terms of the training and the outcome. I was very mindful, and I want to talk to you if we've got time about pursuit and process as opposed to outcome as well. But I was very mindful of like coming down after doing the Ironman. And for me, there was a lot of, for the first time, really a real embodiment of enjoy the process instead of the outcome. But before we get to process, pursuit, process, and outcome, where does exercise fit on that? Because I guess it can kind of fall in both potentially.
Well, exercise is definitely pressing on the pain side of the balance. There's no doubt about that. But it's a nice indirect source of dopamine, because what happens when we press on the pain side is that the gremlins hop on the pleasure side. So essentially, through doing exercise, we get our dopamine indirectly as an opponent process response or an after response. If you contrast this with intoxicants press on the pleasure side and immediately release large amounts of dopamine, but there's a heavy price to pay in that we then go into this dopamine deficit state before going back to baseline. That's not true with exercise. Exercise, we pay up front, right? And then we cash in our dopamine as dopamine gradually increases over the course of exercising and then remains elevated for hours afterwards before going gently back down to baseline levels. Now, having said that, we can still get addicted to exercise. So anything that is a source of dopamine is something that we can get addicted to. It's a lot harder to get addicted to exercise. It's quite a bit rarer because of all the upfront costs involved in getting your dopamine through exercise. But of course, I have treated patients with significant exercise addiction who have, for example, developed fractures. They keep running, doing their sport, even when medically they should definitely stop. They spend so much time in their exercise that it's at a cost to family and friends. And as mentioned, health. So this is clearly, we can overdo it. Further, if we take a painful stimulus and we make it so potent that we signal to the body, oh, I'm about to die, for example, jumping out of an airplane or cutting ourselves, which potently releases our endogenous opioids, then essentially we've turned that into a drug, right? We've essentially turned it into something that's not pressing. It's pressing on the pain side so hard and so fast that our brains just will spill out as much dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine as we have in storage as a way to kind of protect us from imminent threat. And then that then results in, basically the dopamine deficit state that we're trying so hard to avoid. So the key is mild to moderate doses of exercise or other noxious stimuli so that we get the gremlins to hop gently on the pleasure side and reset our reward thresholds to pleasure, not this kind of huge bolus of pain that then counteracts with this huge bolus of endogenous feel-good hormones and neurotransmitters, which then can further only result in that come down on the other side.
What's your take on dopamine in the pursuit process and I guess the anticipation? And you give a really good example with, I think he, I don't know what you classified him as, but a guy who, it wasn't porn, but it was essentially sex addiction, albeit self-sex with the tools and stuff that he was using in the build-up of the anticipation. So what's the dopamine process in terms of pursuit, process, and anticipation, as opposed to the actual event or outcome?
Yeah, so I think some of the best ways to understand this is to look at the animal studies where we've been able to put probes in a rat's brain and actually measure dopamine levels. And of course, what we find is if a rat knows that if it presses a lever, it's going to get an intravenous bolus of cocaine. When it gets that cocaine, there's a huge spike in dopamine above baseline levels. If we then train the rat to know that when it sees a light or hears a bell, then if it goes to press the lever, it will deliver cocaine. But other than that, the lever won't deliver cocaine. Then the rat comes to associate the light or the bell with the cocaine. And what we see in that instance is that there's actually a small release of dopamine above baseline levels just when the rat sees the light or hears the bell. So before they even get the cocaine, when they know the cocaine is coming, there's a little release of dopamine, followed very importantly by a little dopamine deficit state. So the gremlins hop on the pain side of the balance to counteract that anticipation. And that's what creates the craving that drives the motivation to get the drug. So when patients will talk about craving, they're often not just talking about like a mental experience. They often have physical craving. And that's probably very likely because the euphoric recall of the drug itself caused a little dopamine spike followed by a dopamine deficit state, which is that state of physiologic craving, which is so powerful, which drives, the willingness to work to get the drug to get out of that painful state. So that anticipation of the reward, and when we put our creativity and our effort into gearing up to get the reward, that's very often in and of itself can be an important part of the addiction process as we're anticipating the high, because that in itself can create a high.
What's the process of someone rebalancing essentially homeostasis as you keep talking about? And I assume someone with a extreme addiction as opposed to someone who's just slightly out with that pleasure pain, it might be slightly different, but what's that process look like if someone's to go, okay, so, got the understanding of pleasure pain and I want to start making some inroads. What does that process look like as we start to kind of rebalance homeostasis and what time frame potentially would they be looking at?
Well, I have an acronym in the book that's dopamine, which I think is a helpful frame for knowing what to do. The D stands for data. So this is where we identify what is that behavior, that drug that I have a conflicted relationship with. I consume more than I want. It's interfering with my goals, values, health, what have you. So identifying that, and then either writing it down on a piece of paper or telling somebody else, a therapist or a friend or a loved one, what exactly we're doing, how much we're doing, how often. When we do that, when we put it into words are really tools. And they're tools that make maps, and maps guide our future. So we're making it real in a way that it can be sort of hidden in the recesses of our minds until we've spoken it aloud or written it down. So that's the first step. What is the thing? And it might be one or two things, but there's usually one thing that people can identify. I want to stop that. I want to stop doing that, or I want to change the way I do that. The O of dopamine stands for objectives. I think it's really good to spend a little time thinking about, why do I do that thing, right? What is my objective? Because then we can contrast that with, is it really achieving that? For example, I have lots of patients who come in and say, I smoke pot to relieve anxiety and depression. That's their objective. And in the short term, it really does, reestablish homeostasis. The problem is every time they smoke, they add more balance to the pain side of their gremlins, and it's actually making the depression and anxiety worse over time. But that's something that it's hard to see in the moment, right? So why do I do it? Then the P of dopamine stands for problems. That's where we admit to ourselves, okay, what is not working out about this behavior? Why is it, what are the real costs? And really be really honest, write them down, this interaction with this person, that consequence at work, that consequence with my grades, here's my health, or even just subtle dysphoria, anxiety, irritability that might feel like it's being self-medicated by our use, but might actually be being made worse by our use. And then the A of the dopamine acronym stands for abstinence. That's where we commit to a period of abstinence long enough for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off and for homeostasis to be restored. Now, in my experience, it takes on average 30 days for that to happen. The first 2 weeks are hell. We're in withdrawal. The balance is tilted to pain. But if we can wait long enough for the gremlins to hop off, for homeostasis to be restored, usually by weeks 3 and 4, people feel a lot better. Now, some people, it might not take that long, right? For some other people, it might take longer. But I really feel like if you choose that one behavior, try to abstain for 30 days. Also, you can wrap your head around 30 days. It's not 6 months. It's not 10 years. It's not a lifetime. It's 30 days. We can do that. The caveat there is, of course, if I have a patient who says, I've tried 1 million times to stop my own and haven't been able to go 2 or 3 days, much less 30 days, I don't do the experiment. I say, maybe you need to go to rehab or some other higher level of care. Also, if I have a patient who's physiologically dependent on alcohol or benzos like Xanax, and I'm worried about life-threatening withdrawal, I don't recommend this experiment, right? I say, go see a doctor. You need medically supervised detoxification. On the other hand, if they tell you, well, I know I can stop drinking alcohol without going into life-threatening withdrawal, I'll be uncomfortable, then it's okay. Because most people will not have a life-threatening withdrawal, but still you gotta know which group you're in. And then, that's a period of discomfort, but it's also an opportunity for, mindfulness. The M of dopamine stands for mindfulness, where we learn to sit with our uncomfortable feelings without running away from them and just observe them without judgment. It's also an opportunity for insight. I stands for insight, so that we can really see true cause and effect of our substance use on our lives. Very many times my patients who are successful in that 30-day absence will look back and be shocked. They're like, I don't even recognize myself. It's amazing that I put that much valence on getting my drug and using my drug to the exclusion of these other things that I actually care a lot about. So it can be a real eye-opener, a source of insight. And then the N of dopamine stands for next steps. That's where patients come back and we do a pros and cons list. What was good about not using for a month? What was bad about not using? People will say, I couldn't hang out with my friends and it was really boring, because all of a sudden you got all this time, right? So then you talk about pros and cons. And then the E, the N stands for next steps. Okay, what do you want to do next? Do you want to continue to abstain, or do you want to go back to using in moderation? Almost everyone wants to go back to using in moderation. Some people can and some people can't. I don't really judge anymore, because I'm not a good predictor of who can and who can't. I've had patients who I thought, no way are they going to go back to using in moderation. They were able to do it. And other patients I thought, oh yeah, sure, moderation will work for them. It didn't, right? So that's kind of a sifting process over the course of several months, or even many months in some cases, where you sort of decide, okay, am I an abstainer, or am I a moderator? And let me just say, I talk a lot in the book too about self-binding, sort of like barriers we can put between ourselves and our drug of choice, including, by the way, chemical barriers, because we have new drugs now that help people with addiction, things like opioid receptor blockers or glutamate and GABA modulators, which can really help appetitive control, so that people might actually be able to use in moderation who maybe without those drugs couldn't. And then the E for the acronym stands for experiment. That's where we set a very specific plan for abstinence or for moderation. Patients go back into the world and give it a try, and then come back again. And we say, did it work? Did it not work? How do we tweak this?
It's brilliant. And I want to congratulate you again on the book. I found it fascinating and really gave me such a different perspective on addiction. So thank you for your work. It's phenomenal. Where can people find you if they want to? Definitely go out and buy the book, guys. Dopamine Nation, it's phenomenal. But where can people find you if they want to kind of find out more about what you do?
I'm not on social media, because I know that if I were, I would use it compulsively. So I'm not really that findable, but they can listen to your podcast.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks again very much for everything that you do, Anna. It's been phenomenal.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in this week. As always, if you enjoyed listening, please leave a review, give us a shout out across socials, or share with a friend, so that we can continue to share these incredible conversations with more and more people.